If one man dies, newspapers will decry a murder. If a dozen dies, they'll decry a mass murder. If 1,000 dies, it's a tragedy. Or what do we call it when, at minimum, 500,000 innocent people die? Do we call it a crisis? Do we call it the internal issues of another state? Do we get involved to help? Or do we stick our heads in the sand and say, it's no issue of ours? Do we remember what happened, or do we hide from it and hope history won't do that thing that it loves to do over and over again, repeating itself? This is the story of the 21st century's worst humanitarian crisis, the Syrian Civil War. So in 1967, Syria, Egypt, and Jordan went to war with Israel in a conflict that would later become known as the 6 Days War, which would shape much of the Middle East as we know it today. It would be during this war that Syria would lose 2/3 of its prized Golan Heights in just 48 hours. From the turmoil of this military defeat, a relatively unknown minister of government, the Minister of Defense, Hafez al-Assad, would set his eyes on the top job. Only 3 years after that war, Assad would lead a new coup against Salah Jadid, a man who had only been in the top job for 4 years since his own coup in 1966. Assad would be a hardliner totalitarian. He'd introduce a new police state on the framework of trigger-happy secret police, brutal use of torture, and an iron grip on the media. It's hard to pin what was about to happen on a single person, but if anyone could be blamed for the crisis to come, it would be Assad. Then in 1973, Syria would again attempt an invasion of Israel alongside their old ally of Egypt in the Yom Kippur War. This war would only last slightly more than the previous at 19 days, but it would result in Israel pushing even deeper into Syria's territory, yet again driving a wedge between the people of Syria and their government, with many blaming Assad personally for their failure in the war. Because if their government couldn't keep them safe, then who could? It would be through such a loss of faith that Syria would be plunged into intermittent civil war from 1976 to 1982 against the extremist group the Muslim Brotherhood, a precursor to organizations like al-Qaeda, al-Shabaab, and ISIS. This civil war would be brutal and culminate in the Hama massacre, where forces under the command of Assad himself would be ordered to besiege the town of Hama in such a brutal way that an estimated 40,000 innocent civilians would die. Not that this mattered to Assad, all he wanted is what all authoritarian dictators want, to remain in power. He had succeeded in overseeing the destruction of the Muslim Brotherhood of Syria, but he had only strengthened the resolve of the people to find a new leader, a new way forward that would take them away from the bloody ways of the regime. Throughout the remainder of the 80s, Assad would keep control through the same brutal means he had used to secure his power. But a change was coming. Thanks to the failures of the numerous wars against Israel, Assad had reached the conclusion that he could no longer trust Egypt and Jordan to keep him safe. He needed a new ally. To this, he turned his eye to a new contender in the Middle East, an up-and-comer by the name of the United States of America. In a move that not only turned him against many of his former allies, but further pushed the people of Syria to hate their dictator, Assad joined the Gulf War in 1991 on the side of the United States. This granted Assad a powerful new friend, but in truth, it was just another piece of the puzzle undermining any authority and any loyalists that he still had in his country. By this point, Syria was nothing but a powder keg waiting to blow, waiting for the right madman to light the match next to that pre-laid trail of gunpowder. And then it ended. Assad died in 2000 of old age. So at this point, you're probably wondering, how can that be? Haven't we all heard news stories of a man called Assad in Syria? Is it not the same guy? Well, like all good dictators, Hafez al-Assad had a plan for when he died, and that involved his son, Bashar al-Assad, who would take over as the new president of Syria after his death. Of course, though, Syria wanted to keep up appearances with their newest ally, and so ran fair and democratic elections in which Bashar was the only candidate. Still, hope was on the horizon for the people of Syria, since the new Assad's election and the organization known as the Damascus Spring had sprung up. This group campaigned for reforms to Syria's most totalitarian laws and for a litany of market reforms that would bring the country more in line with their newest Western ally. Not only was the Spring hopeful for these reforms, but the people of Syria were too. On numerous occasions, the newer Assad had claimed to regret the choices of his father and stated that he wished to fix the relationship between the Syrian people and their leader. And so, promptly, in 2001, the young Assad showed all the people of Syria just how rule would go when he had the organizers of the Damascus Spring arrested and thrown in jail for the remainder of their lives. He had demonstrated that he had watched his father's methods closer, and that he had learned that his father was simply too merciful, and a new wave of brutal crackdowns began. With that, the match had been lit. Assad had taken away the only thing the people of Syria had left to cling on to: hope. With their hope extinguished, they no longer had any reason not to rebel, not to light the match, and they just would accept that they'd have to rebuild. And from then on, the crisis became inevitable. Now, throughout the remainder of the 2000s, much of Syria's ongoings were marred with conflicts with Israel over an alleged nuclear plan in which North Korean scientists were brought to Syria to construct nuclear reactors. Beyond that, Assad's regime seemed to be relatively stable, although clearly built on a mountain of bodies and gunpowder. And then protesters in Tunisia took the match to the fuse. In 2010, Tunisia saw protests surrounding its government's rampant corruption, and from there the wave of protests spread across the entire Arab world. This kickstarted the Arab Spring, a movement overthrowing countless governments, which would reach Syria in July of 2011. Assad had been watching, though. He saw when the leaders of Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and Yemen were deposed. He saw when his people marched onto the streets, and he knew he had to take action. So what does a cornered dictator do when he's surrounded by the ghosts of his father's crimes? Well, he strikes out. And that's what Assad did. Assad ordered the Syrian police and Syrian army to open fire on the protesters and disperse them at all costs. Assad was either an idiot or blind to the fact that the vast majority of his own people hated him for one reason or another, and soon the first mutinies started taking place. Before the end of September 2011, the Free Syrian Army had been declared, which mostly consisted of former officers of the Syrian army who claimed to fight for the ideal of a united and democratic Syria. It would be the same year that both ISIS and al-Nusra would arrive in Syria and claim the allegiance of those who still followed the ideals of the Muslim Brotherhood's uprising. With that crisis in full swing, a coalition of predominantly Western countries entered Syria on a mission of destroying ISIS. Other countries, such as Russia, entered Syria with the intent of propping up the Assad regime, while others still, such as the US, propped up the Syrian Free Army. Everyone had known for years that a war was coming, that chaos would be wrought and Syria would pay the price, but despite that, nobody could predict the brutality of what was to come. In the build-up to the war, the people of Syria did all they could to get out. Immediately, as many as 5 million refugees flooded from Syria into surrounding Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon, and Turkey, almost completely overwhelming the countries they fled to, which were also struggling under the pressing weight of the so-called Islamic State. This instantly brought their plight to the attention of the United Nations, who pled with all sides to allow the clear passage of civilians out of the country. Please, that fell on deaf ears. For the most part, it is agreed that the Syrian Free Army made some attempt to evacuate civilians from the territory in which it fought, but Assad's forces and the IS-aligned forces in the country not only showed a complete disregard for civilian life, but at times showed only what can be referred to as contempt for the civilians in their path. Assad's forces have been accused of often compelling civilian men of fighting age to join their forces and fight against the Free Army and Islamic State. They have equally been accused of carrying out horrific massacres comparable to those carried out by the elder Assad in the darkest days of his reign of terror. Islamic State forces have also been accused of conscripting not only men but even children, posting various videos to social media around the time of the height of the early civil war, showing children being trained with weapons and practicing with those weapons on captured prisoners. At the same time, the Islamic State carried out what has been termed ethnic cleansing on both minority ethnic groups within Syria and certain religious sects around the country. To make matters worse, many of the countries in which people initially tried to flee were overrun by the Islamic State, and so more often than not, a family attempting to escape the horror of the Syrian Civil War would simply walk into another horror. No matter where civilians looked, they found nothing but the specter of war and death awaiting them, and soon the horses of pestilence and famine would follow. With the country ruins beyond the point of repair, there is no limit to the stories of families having to turn to cannibalizing those too weak to keep up, and of other entire refugee convoys falling to the litany of illnesses that spread across the war zone. By the end of 2013, the United Nations estimated that 100,000 civilians, of which 11,000 were children, had died as a direct result of the conflict. They equally reported that an estimated 4.9 million civilians had fled to the surrounding countries with no realistic means of measuring how many of those had survived their journeys. This conflict had built up for 50 years, And it showed no sign of stopping, and indeed, at the time of writing this episode, the war still rages. 12 years after it began, in the peaceful protests surrounding the Arab Spring, chaos still reigns in Syria. Today, the UN estimates that upwards of 14 million Syrians from all walks of life have been forced to flee their homes, that a further 6.8 million Syrians have been internally displaced within Syria, and that at least 500,000 innocent children have died as a direct result of this conflict, with many academics who have taken a look at this conflict holding the view that the true death toll of civilians may be as much as 10 times that number. When Assad gave those orders to his men to shoot innocent peaceful protesters, he began a conflict that has murdered Syria, a conflict that has sparked the worst humanitarian crisis of the 21st century, and one that risks overcoming even the worst crises of the 20th century. And yet, the horror of this story does not stop. The UN estimates that around 6 million refugees are housed in Jordan, Turkey, Iraq, Lebanon, and Egypt, the countries surrounding Syria. Yet that leaves another 8 million refugees out there in the world. And while the UN is certain that around 1 million are currently safely housed in Germany and hundreds of thousands are housed in other predominantly European countries, there are countless more that simply can't be found. The Syrian war has had an impact far broader than just on Syria. The UNODC, the arm of the UN tasked with dealing with human trafficking and fighting so-called modern-day slavery, has assessed that there are more people in trafficking and slavery alive today than there may ever have been in the entirety of human history. Of the groups deemed most at risk of being subjected to such trafficking or slavery, refugees surrounding the consequences of the events in Syria are at the very top. We know from the post-mortem that has already been commenced on so-called ISIS that ISIS sold people into slavery and that those people were transported around the world. We know that countless others, desperate to give their children a better life, have sold their children to human traffickers in the vague hope that their lives would be better elsewhere. This is just one facet of the human cost of the Syrian Civil War, a boom in the international slave trade. It wasn't enough for those people to lose their homes, their friends, and many of their families, but they also lost their freedom. For that is what has been put onto them by the chaos that was allowed to fester for so long. This is not even to mention those refugees who have made it all the way to Europe but now find themselves stuck in refugee camps that run rampant with disease, crime, and sectarian violence. There's no way of knowing exactly how many people are in these camps or from what conflicts they came, particularly with refugees from the war in Ukraine now also being added to the mix. Even then, the numbers published by UNICEF in 2022 point to 12.4 million refugees in Europe alone, not counting all the refugees who have fled to the Middle East or broader afield. It is to escape horror like human trafficking, like modern slavery, like the disease and crime running rampant in overpopulated refugee camps, that from 2020 to 2023 alone, it's estimated that upwards of 150,000 predominantly Syrian refugees attempted to cross the English Channel or the Mediterranean, of which thousands drown and die every year in the hopes of reaching a better life. Ultimately, the purpose of this episode was to help you understand the plight of the Syrian people. Imagine for a moment your place in society. Perhaps you're a doctor, a teacher, a taxi driver, an electrician, and you live in a country that has been ruled over by authoritarian despots for as long as even your parents can remember. Then your country erupts into a bloody civil war with 3 factions, of which each is just as likely to kill you as they are to torture you, or conscript you, or even just let you go. Then you finally make the difficult decision to leave everything in your life, everything you've worked for, your house, your job, your pets, all gone. You flee for your life, for your children's lives. When you finally reach the new location, a journey that took you through war zones and probably took years, you find unwelcoming crowds telling you to go back where you belong, before being herded into camps reminiscent of those seen during the World Wars. Camps where crime and disease are rampant, where it can hardly be said that there is any future for you. Camps where you must wait for overstressed government employees to finally come and catalogue your name and maybe find you better accommodation. From here, you have the option of maybe making a dangerous channel crossing or selling yourself into slavery. Yeah, you won't be free, but at least you won't be here, and anywhere has to be better than here, right? Now imagine if you have children, perhaps selling them to that man who promised them better lives elsewhere is risky, but at least they'd have a chance. These are the decisions and the nightmares upwards of 14 million people have had to go through as a result of the conflict that began in 2011, but had its roots all the way back in the colonial occupation of Syria. This is what those refugees have to go through every day, and that's what we want you to remember.